So, hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. I'm Jacob Reynolds, delighted this week to be joined by our executive director, Frank Furedi. Frank.
Nice to be here.
And we're also joined by Javier Villamor, who's a writer for the European Conservative. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation.
So, we had a little break off for Easter, but we're now back and there's plenty to discuss. This week on the podcast, we're going to be taking a look at the UK's seismic Supreme Court ruling on what is a woman. We're also going to look a little bit more broadly at the idea of the vibe shift and whether we're seeing a turn towards kind of conservative thought in general. And then finally, we're going to be looking at a series of fines that have been levied by the EU on Apple and Meta. Right, so coming first to this Supreme Court ruling in the UK. We don't often touch on UK issues on the MCC Brussels podcast, but this one is kind of so big and we'd like to think it might set something of an example for the rest of Europe that I really wanted to discuss it with the two of you. And so for our viewers, basically what's happened is a case was brought to the highest court in the UK, the Supreme Court, which focused around the interpretation of an Equality Act that was passed in the UK some time ago, and they'd been interpreted in various ways, and the case was brought to decide whether women in the Act meant women as we know them, old-fashioned biological women, or whether these kind of new women that often don't have the women parts, as it were, could be included in this. And the Supreme Court, surprising many people, given the kind of scale of the scale of the kind of transgender craziness, actually sided with the TERF, the women who'd brought this case, a group called For Women Scotland, and it's produced kind of massive effects in the UK. But Frank, firstly, we welcome the ruling. What happened? And this was one to celebrate, right?
Yeah, it was a great event. It was unfortunate that we live in a world where you have got to go to the Supreme Court to tell the obvious, which is that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. But that's the sign of the times. And it was had a great impact on basically giving a lot of people confidence to challenge transgender ideology. So the best thing about it was that the day after the ruling, the pushback against transgender ideology acquired greater momentum. However, I think it's important to realize that the forces who promoted transgender ideology are still very strong. They still dominate the schools in England and Scotland, and children still get indoctrinated by this ideology. And all the institutions that exist in Britain that really matter, like the National Health Service and various public services, are still involved in this and haven't given up on this altogether. And if you looked at the demonstrations against the ruling in Britain, one thing that was very, very clear was that the mainstream media was totally on side with the demonstrators. I just want to make one little observation, which is the day after the ruling, I looked at the New York Times, the front page, and the New York Times basically had the headline, "Trans activists are disappointed by this ruling." It was very, very clear that the New York Times was very much against the ruling. And throughout Europe and America, you find that there's a real incomprehension is how come that Britain has gone down this road and that the Supreme Court has taken this course of action, which tells me that the impact of this ideology globally is still very powerful and is a major threat to everyday life.
Yeah, and Javier, very different circumstances here in the European Union, but is this something we can kind of take to heart, that unlikely a similar case would win in the European courts as well? But what did you take from the ruling?
Well, first of all, it's important to understand that it's not a picture itself. Of course, it's it's a winning, at least for a small period of time, but they are not our allies. You are talking about the TERFs. We say in Spain, for example, evil destroy itself. So, it's important to push somehow these fights between the left and the hard left, or the woke left, if you want to call it like that. But they are not our allies at the end of the day. These women were like hard feminist, and they were also in favor of the quotas, gender quotas. Everything began in 2010. So they support these gender quotas, which I suppose we are against them. But at least it's some kind of common sense coming to the legislation. Related to the European Union, I don't think that we want to have that in the close future. A good thing of England is an example of what the European Union is going to be in 20 years. And somehow we can learn from that. The slippery slope is a long way to go. And as you said, Frank, this is not the end of the woke world, not at all. There's still many things to do, but at least biology now has been settled as a scientific concept, which man is man and woman is woman. That's an important, at least important point to start with.
So I slightly disagree with Javier because
That's good.
the way that I look at it is that the TERFs have been really very good in the way that they single-handedly fought on this issue, especially given the fact that the Conservatives in Britain rolled over. And the Conservative Party in particular played a despicable role in allowing all these ideas to become mainstreamed and institutionalized. And okay, so we don't agree with people involved in this movement on many, many things. But on this really crucial issue, really singularly crucial issue, they played a very brave role, and they kind of faced a lot of difficult circumstances, difficult challenges. And I think we have to learn at this moment in time to work with all kinds of people, so that, we have people, for example, in religious institutions that are in the forefront of the gender ideology movement, even though they're religious and, claim to believe in God. Whereas sometimes you will find that old school feminists with whom you might disagree on many, many things are much closer to us on a variety of issues. And that's the difficulty of our time, when we cannot really choose who fights alongside of us, but we do need a lot more allies if we're going to prevail in this culture war that we're involved in.
I maybe didn't explain myself correctly. What I meant is like that, they are not allies in an ideological way, but of course for some battles you have to choose different allies. The same, for example, for gender ideology. I know this is not probably welcome from many religious people, but Muslims are an ally against gender ideology, for example, especially in Britain. They are the only ones that can, block gender ideology in the schools. Some people are afraid of Muslim groups, but not against Christians. And I guess this is the same. For example, why the TERFs could achieve that victory? Because they're women. And they can use that nowadays in their favor. But imagine you have to, or you wanted to do that. We wouldn't achieve that being men. That's my thought. That's my guess. So yes, it's important, women, to take one step in front of forward and start defending this. Also in Spain, we're having a lot of victories from the women's side. They're leftist women, they're feminist women, but they're counterattacking. And I think that's important, as you said.
And Frank and Javier as well. We can celebrate court rulings like this generally, but it's not the be-all and end-all, is it? Just winning in the court. There's also kind of broader social struggle. We don't want this to just be something that's subject to kind of legal norms. We also need to win a broader struggle.
Yeah, because we have to remember that the fight is only just beginning. Mm-hmm. And the day after or the week after the court ruling does not mean that suddenly the whole ideological balance of power has fundamentally shifted. All that it means is that we can use that. So, for example, we can use the ruling of the court against the claims that the World Health Organization makes, who are much more prepared to accept gender ideology and deny the facts of biology. So the way that I look at it is that we can use that to some extent. And as I said earlier on, the really important thing is that a lot of people who in their hearts of hearts know that there's something really wrong with gender ideology, but have been too scared to open their mouth, may now find a little bit of courage. And we need more people to open their mouth instead of just simply looking at their shoelaces while the world passes them by.
That's a good thing. Victories like this can encourage all people to do their own little battles and their own everyday life, which I think is important. Sometimes when I go around, people ask me, it's easier for you because you're a journalist. But what are you? I'm a lawyer. I'm a businessman. That's also important. We have to do whatever we can do in our jobs, in our family, in our friends' ambient. So for this, I think this could be a nice backup for all the people that are afraid of the consequences of the gender ideology. And somehow they said, no more. This is no more. The consequences are horrible, especially as we can see in England, right? So many people affected by transgender, not only ideologies, but therapies and so on. And I think that's also a good example for us as Europeans in the other side of the continent to start blocking this and do whatever we can do at legal basis.
Yeah, well, the European Conservative has a nice piece today about how the German organization funded by the state is promoting DIY online therapy. So this is hardly restricted to the UK.
It's everywhere along the continent.
Right, the next issue I wanted us to discuss is something that we've kind of skirted around on the podcast before, but there have been a few articles recently that made me want to discuss it in more detail with you both, which is the idea that of the vibe shift, as it's called, the idea that kind of conservative or populist thought is now either mainstream or a bit cool, and we saw this a lot, especially after the victory of Donald Trump in the election, where lots of Democrats suddenly were very, very quiet. People assumed that it wasn't just they'd won an election, but somehow they kind of shifted the entire that landmass of kind of popular opinion. And now that the kind of cultural hegemony is now perhaps with the right rather than with the left. Javier, what do you make of this idea?
I like to say that conservatism now is the new punk. I don't know if that's true at all. But let's see that, as you said, probably the cultural battle, as Frank liked to talk about, is changing, and I don't know, we can say we're winning, but at least people are upset of the system itself, which means that the young generations can see whatever forces against the system are as more attractive as the actual system itself. And let's say woke, left, or even globalist rights, if we want to talk about that also. So that means that in some aspects or some areas like social media, what X is now is not what Twitter used to be. Mm-hmm. People are losing, that own auto-censorship. They are willing to talk about things that they didn't used to talk before, and they don't care anymore. They don't care of the consequences. I don't know if this is good or bad, but at least the more people can talk freely, not only social media, but in a regular basis, the more we're going to break the ceiling. And I think that's important for a political change in the future. You talk about the Donald Trump victory. I don't know if that will help the cultural battle itself, because what he does is not always, the better way or the best way for do things, I guess. But this is a change, and some countries, like in Germany, we're seeing now that the AfD is top in the polls over the CDU. Spain is not going to be bad. In England, well, I think you have a long way to go now. In France, we're seeing what is happening. So I don't know. I think that probably in the 10 to 15 years, the cultural battle will mean a political victory, and that's something that we do not have to forget about.
Yeah, and Frank, I mean, this kind of goes back a long way, this idea that the more important battle is a kind of cultural battle, which has various different forms. Some people think it means that politics isn't important at all, and you do other people mean that there are political issues in the general culture. But you were sharing with us earlier a series of articles about how even vegetarianism and veganism is kind of falling out of fashion in the States. Is this what we mean when we say that the culture has shifted?
Yeah, the culture is really everything. And people try to compartmentalize it, but the way that it works is that there are a certain set of assumptions, from lifestyle to the way you dress to the way you react to someone like Trump or a politician, which define who you are. So even before you open your mouth, if I know a few things about you, I can tell how you will react to a particular phenomenon. And I always remember that the day after October the 7th, I was giving a talk, and I made a point that I've got no doubt that all the LGBTQ people will go for Hamas rather than Israel, because there is something that will draw them in that kind of direction. And what has happened now is good, but it's the beginning of something potentially really positive, which is that because of the victory of Trump, second time around, it's really shaken the confidence of the ruling elite everywhere, the political and cultural oligarchies that run the different societies, because until now they could more or less say, well, Trump's victory in 2016 was a bit of a random, sort of event. Mm-hmm. Brexit was a random event. But one day these things will pass you by. Now they can see that these things are deeply entrenched, and for that reason they have become very demoralized. That's why there was no reaction or demonstration against Trump when he got in. But what's also happened is that there are some positive things that have occurred. For example, in Hollywood, there is now a group of film directors who are basically committed to making films that are not really promoting the woke values that Hollywood is kind of famous for. And there are initiatives that are taking place where putting forward what we can call countercultural views, which again is really, really positive. And also, I think, very importantly, like we discussed in the earlier item, a lot more people are prepared to open their mouth. They basically find their voice and indicate, which side they're on. However, we cannot imagine that the culture is going to be changed by governments. So I don't think, for example, the attempt by the Trump administration and elsewhere to change the universities by legal means or not giving them money is going to do very much. All that is going to do is basically radicalize more students in the wrong direction, because they will see it as an interference in their academic freedom. And I think there's a danger of imagining that the state can be used in this particular kind of a way. So in the end, the best people to fight back against their kind of cultural ideals are people like us, rather than officials and government and institutions. And we have to learn how to become more persuasive, use this opportunity. Really use this opportunity to kick back against them.
Yeah, and Javier, it's become obvious, and maybe we will face similar struggles in European countries, that to tear down some of the extreme madness, to defund some of the DEI craziness, etc. That's kind of the easy part, and then the hard part comes next.
Exactly. When we look for the last 40 years, somehow, what we have been suffering, let's say, it's an elite revolution. So thanks to reports like you have done in MCC and other studies around, we've seen that how much money have been, pushed or funded in all this kind of madness revolution we have been living, especially in the last 20 years. So it's an elite revolution from up, down. And what we're seeing somehow this, if we want to call it the people revolution. I don't like that, that concept could be dangerous, but I guess that you understand the meaning. It's so the normal citizens are, they are completely, they said no anymore. I'm upset with this. This is the red line. And they're trying to find ways to express their feelings, their ideas, their views about politics, cultural nation, political nation, or whatever. And I think that's, we can see that how the elites also prevent that to happen with the laws that we are seeing right now passing, at least in the European Union. We have the Digital Services Act. We have also, not the digital market, but especially the Digital Services Act, which prevent people to communicate and to, how to say in English, foment, to push for a change from down to up instead of the classical elite revolution up to down. And as I said before, it's a huge change, which I don't think is gonna happen in at least 20 years. But what I'm afraid of is that they are trying to do whatever they can to block it, especially in England. You have also now these anti-terrorist laws, which everyone can be included if you're a danger for the democracy, whatever you call. And that can expand also to the European Union, and that will also be applying all over the world. But what we can see is that the China model has been applied in different nations. I remember in 2021 when China was presented as the model of the future by the World Economic Forum. And by the way, we have a new president, the Nestle CEO. The former is Nestle CEO, who said that the free water is not a human right or something like that. So another psychopath. But China is the model, and they won't apply that as in China. They do not in a political model, but in a different way. This is a way to protect democracy a way to protect minorities, this hate speech. They will find a way to prevent a real change, although we think things are changing. And I hope they can change. But I'm afraid it won't change as we think right now.
Yeah, and Frank, one of the things maybe we see from the United States is they kind of run some of the Republicans, or the Trumpism is kind of running into trouble when it moves beyond just issuing executive orders, and you need a broader kind of conception of politics in order to deal with some of these challenges.
You do, but I mean, there is also the MAGA movement, which is a really important development, because for me, the really important thing all along is the movement rather than an individual, because an individual is just, can change their minds from day to day. They're got certain subjective strengths and weaknesses, whereas a movement, the people, are your guarantor that a certain shift can stay and flourish. I'm a little bit less pessimistic than Javier. I maybe it's because I'm old, and maybe I'm not going to be here 20 years from now. So I would like to see some of those changes occurring a little bit earlier on.
I want to see them too, but I don't think we want.
I don't know. I think that in Europe, I feel that there is something in the air. There's a real kind of zeitgeist that has kind of happened. And I know that zeitgeist is going to invite repression. There's going to be attempts to prevent that from kind of gaining momentum. But at the same time, the very fact that we now have this kind of spirit that's in ascendancy within Europe indicates that it is possible to imagine that having a certain degree of strength, which can then begin to alter the balance of power. So that I am, I'm much more optimistic this year, today, than I would have been last year or a year before that, just because you can see that the positive dynamic is getting more and more deeply entrenched, but the stakes are very, very high. And it seems to me that, especially now with protectionism, economic conflict breaking out, with geopolitics returning, with governments throughout Europe being completely unprepared and unable to deal with the challenges they face. You can imagine a situation where we get back to a much more repressive, anti-democratic regimes being established. You can sense that that's really what they're striving to do without having the courage at the moment to go down that road. So, yeah, the stakes are going to be very high, but it's going to be very exciting, a very exciting year this year and next to see whether we can consolidate what's happened in the last 18 months.
Let me rephrase then, not to be that pessimistic. What I mean is that we should not sleep in the victory, as we saw in the 90s with this end of the history. It's not the end of the history, and we have had some winnings, which is nice, but we should not think that this is the end for us, that we need to understand that it's a never-ending battle, and probably we're now on, driving the edge or whatever, but the things will change. This is the pendulum theory. Now we are here, then we will be there, but then probably we'll go to the other direction. So that's what I wanted to say with that. Maybe not that pessimistic, but maybe more realistic in the short term. And also, the world is changing. Europe is changing demographically. The problem also, this cultural war, is that probably we are trying to, what we are talking to is to the people as we are, and people are not as we are, especially in the future. According to data from the European Union, in 2100, less than the half of the European Union will be European native people. And that means a huge shift on the way we communicate and the way how we express ideas, also in a racial basis, because we usually talk to, let's say, European native people, but there are many ways to understand conservatism, right? Not only the European way, we have the American way, probably in the future we have the Asian way, and that's important to understand when you're talking to a mass, different people. And the problem of the cultural now is that although we are winning somehow in other areas, we are not convincing as they are not convincing us anymore. And the problem is that probably in the future we have parallel societies, parallel activities, even ghettos. I always remember Rodriguez's book, the Benedict option. How can we preserve the good of what we have now or we have in the future, but living here today, and how we can improve this for the next generations to come?
Right, so bringing it maybe back down to earth a little bit more, but just today, as just before we sat down to record this episode, the EU announced that it was slapping huge fines on Apple and Meta, 500 and 200 million euros, I think they were under, and some of the first fines, maybe the first fines issued under the Digital Markets Act. Now, on one level, this fits a very familiar pattern for the European Union. Here you got two big American companies, big social media companies, of which the EU doesn't have any, and they love to slap them with fines for supposedly kind of market manipulative behavior. But Javier, tell us, what was the justification of the EU? Does it hold up, or can this be seen as kind of anti-American, anti-Trump sentiment?
Well, it's something they actually ask in the press conference in the European Commission at 12 o'clock every day. And they said this is not a tool to negotiate tariffs with the United States, although I guess that most of the journalists thought it is. Well, the excuse or the reason, I think, let me play again the devil's advocate here. I can understand the reason for the fine if we check that there is some oligopolies, some abuse from, if you have the power to do it, why won't you do it, right? So Apple's had, control of the App Store, and they benefit their own apps, which is, it's logical, I guess. And the Meta is also, they force you to pay and consent if you want to avoid ads. So in that way, I can understand the fine. Probably not the amount. It's 500 to Apple and 200 to Meta, which is a lot. But it's far away from the 10% they expected from the Digital Services Act anyway. But yes, again, the problem is that you are regulating against companies. Most of them are Chinese or American. But the question that no one has is, what about our companies? Do we have any champion, any technological champion to compete against United States or to compete against China? We don't have. But also, again, if we regard to this fine against Meta, and they pay for the non-ads or the ads-free apps, we had the same from some European providers, especially media. What about them? Nobody talks about them. They only focus on United States. So, again, there are two sides of the coin. I understand, but what about the others? Why only Americans? I understand it's only about those companies that have 45. The Digital Services Act was 45, above 45 million unique users per month. But again, what about the European technology? I saw recently from the X profile of Next Generation EU, they are promoting now to consume European technology, European apps, which is quite strange coming from the European Commission, which has been supporting the free market in the last years. And now, because of Trump, again, is this because of Trump, or this is because they are really worried about European consumers? It's difficult to say.
But as far as diplomacy goes, Frank, it doesn't look like the world's most sophisticated diplomacy when dealing with Trump. And they've said specifically this is one of the big issues that they care about.
No, it's not. And I think that when it comes to diplomacy, foreign affairs, the EU is pretty primitive in the way that they've tended to behave. Haven't got the kind of sophistication you need to conduct a proper geopolitical orientation towards the world. That's always been a real weakness on the part of the European Union. It kind of pretends military and foreign postures are always more all talk and no action. But I do think that there is something insidious about the way in which technology companies have been picked out by the EU, because I think that under the guise of dealing with market infringements, or dealing with issues like protecting people from the way that these big companies operate, what they really are trying to do is to have a degree of control over what's communicated and how things are communicated. And I'm always worried that most of their behavior is ultimately based upon this, rather than on anything really kind of positive. So, at a time when we ought to be thinking either of how we reconcile the tension between America and Europe, or alternatively thinking what is the next step for European technology and technological development, what we have is the old response of regulate, penalize, which is the typical bureaucratic way of dealing with complex economic and social issues. So to that extent, I'm totally skeptical and cynical about what has happened, and kind of wish that more wisdom would prevail amongst the Brussels oligarchy.
Yeah, well, certainly the regulation of these social media companies, and which effectively, as you say, is the regulation of speech, is going to be a huge issue for us in the coming weeks. MCC Brussels as well, we're going to be publishing some new work on this, so watch out. But that's it from us this week. If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure you hit like. If you're watching us on YouTube or anywhere else, you can make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss, and leave us a comment. Let us know how you enjoyed it and if you'd like us to tackle anything specific in the coming weeks. But for now, thank you, Frank.
Pleasure.
And Javier, thanks for joining us.
Thank you again. Thank you so much.